Ethan felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the damp November air. It was the cold of a life lived on the periphery, a spectator in his own marriage, an afterthought in his own home. He stood by the freshly dug earth, the scent of overturned soil and wilting flowers heavy in his throat. His father, a man of quiet strength and calloused hands, was gone. The service had been modest, just as his father would have wanted. A simple pine casket, a handful of old friends from the workshop, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. But for his wife, Clara, it was not a memorial. It was a social embarrassment. "Honestly, Ethan," she had hissed in the car on the way to the cemetery, her voice a sharp shard of glass. "Could you not have sprung for something more respectable? People will talk." He had said nothing, his grief a heavy cloak that absorbed her barbs without response. He was used to them. Now, as the last of the mourners offered their condolences and drifted away, Clara's impatience became a palpable force. She tapped her foot, the sharp sound of her designer heel against the gravel path cutting through the somber quiet. She approached him, her face a mask of strained sympathy that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "All right, is it over?" she asked, pulling her expensive cashmere coat tighter around herself as if to ward off the plebeian sorrow of the place. Ethan looked from the grave to his wife. They were two worlds colliding, one of earth and honesty, the other of glitter and facade. "It's a funeral, Clara," he said, his voice raspy. "It's not an event with a scheduled end time." She scoffed, a delicate, ugly sound. "It's a depressing spectacle. Your father was a simple carpenter, Ethan. We get it. Did the whole world need to see just how simple?" The cruelty of the words struck him, but it was a familiar ache. He had built up a tolerance to her venom over the 5 years of their marriage. "He was a good man," Ethan managed to say, his gaze fixed on the mound of dirt. "Good doesn't pay for a mortgage on a house in the right neighborhood," she countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if sharing a dirty secret. "Good doesn't get you a membership at the country club. Good doesn't fund a business that's going to change our lives." Her business. The perpetually failing luxury lifestyle brand that consumed all their money and all her time. It was a black hole of debt and delusion. She reached into her purse, her movements sharp and theatrical. She pulled out a thin stack of bills held together by a gold money clip. With a flick of her wrist, she threw the money at his chest. The bills scattered, a few clinging to the fabric of his dark suit, before fluttering down to the damp ground near his father's grave. "Here," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Go buy yourself a proper suit for these things. You look like a pauper. It reflects badly on me." The act was so stunning, so publicly humiliating, that Ethan simply froze. The few remaining friends of his father, who had been lingering at a respectful distance, stopped and stared. Their faces were a mixture of shock and pity. Ethan looked down at the money, lying like trash on the sacred ground. He felt a tremor of rage, something hot and ancient stir in the pit of his stomach. But, as always, he swallowed it down. "People are watching, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Let them watch," she sneered. "Let them see that at least one of us has some standards." Without another word, she turned and strode back towards her sleek, white car, leaving him standing there amidst the scattered bills and the silent judgment of his father's friends. He felt utterly alone, a ghost at his own father's farewell. As he bent slowly, his joints creaking like an old church door, to pick up the money, a tall, distinguished man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit approached him. He recognized him as Mr. Harrison, his father's lawyer. "Ethan," the man said, his voice a deep and calming bass, "please leave that." Harrison gestured to one of his assistants, who quickly and discreetly gathered the cash. The lawyer's eyes were full of a sorrow that seemed to go beyond the loss of a client. It was the sorrow of a friend. "Your father was one of the finest men I have ever known," Harrison said, ignoring Clara's disgraceful exit. "He spoke of you often, with great pride." Ethan could only nod, the words caught in his throat. Pride was not a word he associated with himself, not anymore. Harrison then held out a small, ornate, old-fashioned key. It was heavy, made of brass, with an intricate design at the top. Along with it, he presented a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a wax stamp Ethan didn't recognize. "Your father left this for you," the lawyer explained. "His instructions were very specific. You are to hold on to this for 30 days. Do not open the envelope. Do not try to use the key." Ethan took the items. They felt strangely significant in his hands, a tangible link to the man he had just lost. "On the 30th day," Harrison continued, handing him a business card, "you will come to the address on this card, bring the key and the envelope, and come alone." The mystery of it was a small, hard stone dropped into the deep well of his grief. It was a distraction, something to hold on to. "I don't understand," Ethan said. "You will," Harrison assured him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your father had his reasons for everything. Trust in that." The lawyer gave him a final, meaningful look before turning to leave. Ethan was left holding a strange key, a sealed letter, and the lingering shame of his wife's cruelty. He had no idea that in his hands he held the beginning of the end and the start of a new, unimaginable beginning. The 30 days that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl through a grey landscape of mourning and quiet observation. Ethan moved through his house like a phantom. The house itself felt more like Clara's than his. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every ridiculously expensive vase was a testament to her taste, her ambition. His own presence was minimal, a worn leather armchair in the corner of the living room, a small stack of woodworking magazines on a side table. He was a tenant in his own life. Clara, for her part, treated his grief as an inconvenience. She flitted in and out of the house, her phone perpetually pressed to her ear, her conversations a frantic mix of pleading with suppliers and placating investors for her failing company, Aura Lifestyle. "You can't just mope around forever, Ethan," she would say, breezing past him in a cloud of perfume that smelled like money and anxiety. "Life goes on. My life at least has to." He learned more about the state of their lives by listening than he ever did from her directly. She believed him to be too simple to understand the complexities of high finance, too beaten down to care. She was wrong. He understood perfectly. He understood that the second mortgage on their house wasn't an investment, but a desperate gamble. He understood that the maxed-out credit cards weren't building a credit line, but staving off collapse. And he was beginning to understand Julian. Julian was a business consultant Clara had hired. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with teeth that were too white and a smile that never reached his eyes. He dressed in flashy suits and drove a sports car that was almost certainly leased. Initially, their meetings were professional, held in coffee shops or at Clara's small, rented office space. But as the days wore on, their interactions grew less discreet. Ethan would come home to find them huddled together over spreadsheets at the dining room table, their heads close. Julian's hand would be on Clara's back, a gesture that was too familiar, too intimate. Clara would see Ethan and wave a dismissive hand. "Oh, Ethan, don't mind us. Just saving the empire. Julian would look up and give Ethan a smirk, a look of such profound condescension that it made Ethan's hands clench into fists in his pockets. It was the look of a wolf sizing up a sheep. One evening, Ethan was in the garage, running his hand over the dusty surface of his father's old lathe, a piece of equipment he'd insisted on keeping. It was his only inheritance he thought he had. The smell of sawdust and oil was a comfort. He heard Clara's car pull into the driveway, followed by the throaty rumble of Julian's. He stayed quiet, hidden in the shadows of the garage. "I just don't know what to do, Julian." Clara's voice was tight with panic. "The bank rejected the preliminary application. They said the business model is too high risk." "Amateurs." Julian's voice was smooth, confident. "They don't understand vision. They don't understand us." "But what are we going to do? I'm out of options. I'm out of money." There was a pause, then the sound of a soft kiss. "Don't worry, my love," Julian murmured. "I have one last ace up my sleeve. A long shot, but a big one. Sterling Legacy Bank." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. "Sterling Legacy?" Clara sounded impressed. "I've heard of them. They're ancient, incredibly private. They don't deal with people like us." "They deal with people with brilliant ideas, and you, my dear, are brilliant," Julian said, his voice oozing flattery. "I have a contact who can get our proposal in front of them. It's a huge loan, Clara, enough to crush our competitors and live the life we deserve." "And Ethan?" she asked, her voice small. "What about him?" Julian laughed. "Once the money comes through, you leave him. You tell the sad little carpenter that you've outgrown him. You give him a small settlement to make him go away, and we start our life together." "He'll be devastated," Clara said, but there was no sympathy in her tone. It was a statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. "He'll get over it," Julian said dismissively. "People like him always do. They're built for disappointment." The garage door opener whirred, and Ethan shrank back into the darkness. They walked past, arm in arm, laughing about some private joke. They didn't even glance in his direction. He stood there for a long time, the cold metal of the lathe beneath his hand. He felt the rage again, but this time it was different. It wasn't hot and fleeting. It was cold, hard, and patient. He took out the key and the envelope Mr. Harrison had given him. He ran his thumb over the wax seal. The 30th day was tomorrow. Clara's overconfidence was a spectacle to behold. Convinced that Julian's plan was a sure thing, she began to act as if the money were already in her bank account. She spent an entire afternoon on the phone with a travel agent, booking a first-class multi-country tour of Europe, a celebratory trip for her and Julian. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Ethan," she'd said when he walked into the room during the call. "It's all museums and fine dining. You'd be bored." She started treating him not just with contempt, but with a kind of pitying disdain. She saw him as a relic of her past, a piece of furniture that would soon be discarded. "You know, Ethan," she said one evening, looking at him across the dinner table he had built with his own hands, "I've been thinking, once the loan comes through, maybe you could take some of that money I gave you at the funeral and enroll in a class, learn a new skill. Something with computers, perhaps." It was a breathtakingly arrogant attempt at charity, a final insult before the execution. "I'm fine with my skills," he replied, his voice even. She sighed dramatically. "That's your problem, Ethan. You're always fine. You have no ambition. Don't you want more out of life?" "What I want," he said, looking her directly in the eye, "is honesty." She had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before her mask of superiority slipped back into place. Honesty is a luxury for people who don't have bills to pay. The morning of the 30th day arrived, crisp and clear. Ethan dressed carefully, Not in his usual work clothes, but in the one good suit he owned, the very suit she had mocked. He found Clara in the kitchen sipping coffee and scrolling through a high-end real estate website on her laptop. "I have an appointment this morning," he said simply. She didn't look up. "Fine, just don't be late. Julian is taking me out for a celebratory lunch. We've got a good feeling about today." "I'm sure you do," he said. He paused at the door, the key heavy in his pocket, the envelope tucked into his jacket. He looked back at his wife, so absorbed in her fantasy of a life built on deceit. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were already watching her from a great distance. He was not the man she thought he was. He was his father's son, and she was about to find out exactly what that meant. The address on Mr. Harrison's card did not lead to a typical modern office building. It led him to the heart of the old financial district, to a street lined with formidable stone structures that spoke of old money and quiet power. The building itself was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture. Sterling Legacy Bank was carved into the granite archway above the massive bronze doors. There was no flashy signage, no advertising. It didn't need any. It exuded an aura of permanence, as if it were a part of the city's bedrock. Ethan pushed open one of the heavy doors. The interior was just as intimidating. The floors were polished marble, the ceilings were high and vaulted, and the only sound was the hushed murmurs of quiet efficiency. Tellers worked behind ornate brass grills, speaking in low tones to a clientele that looked like they owned the world. He approached the main desk, where a severe-looking woman looked up at him over her spectacles. "Can I help you?" "I have an appointment with Mr. Harrison," Ethan said, his voice sounding small in the cavernous space. Her demeanor changed instantly. "Of course, sir. He's expecting you." She made a quick phone call, and within moments, Mr. Harrison himself emerged from a hallway, his hand extended. "Ethan, right on time. Please come with me." He led Ethan not to a standard office, but towards a private elevator, operated with a special key. As they ascended, the quiet hum of the bank faded away. "I imagine you have many questions," Harrison said, his tone gentle. "You could say that," Ethan replied, clutching the envelope in his jacket pocket. The elevator opened directly into a vast, luxurious office. It was more like a study, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable leather furniture, and a massive mahogany desk. A large window offered a panoramic view of the entire city. "Please have a seat," Harrison said, gesturing to one of the chairs in front of the desk. He, however, did not sit behind it. He sat in the chair next to Ethan. "Before we begin," the lawyer said, "I want to tell you a story. It's about your father." Ethan listened, rapt, as Harrison painted a picture of a man he barely knew. His father, David, had not been a simple carpenter by trade. He had been a genius, a self-taught financial prodigy who, in his early 20s, had developed a revolutionary algorithm for market prediction. He made a fortune, a staggering one, before he was 30, Harrison explained. But the world of high finance disgusted him. He saw the greed, the corruption, the way it destroyed people, so he decided to disappear. David sold his algorithms, converted his assets, and founded Sterling Legacy Bank with a single guiding principle: to be a force for stability and ethical growth, not reckless speculation. He put the entire ownership into a complex web of anonymous trusts and holding companies. "And then," Harrison continued, "he went back to his first love, woodworking, and he wanted to live an honest life, to work with his hands. He wanted to raise a son far away from the poison of extreme wealth." The lawyer leaned forward. "He built this entire institution, Ethan, and he ran it from afar, through me, his most trusted advisor. He lived in that small house and worked in that dusty workshop because he wanted to. It was his fortress of solitude." Ethan was speechless. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of his quiet, humble father with this titan of industry. "He watched you your entire life," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "He saw your work ethic, your humility, your quiet strength. He saw how you endured your difficult marriage. He saw that the poison had not touched you. He knew you were worthy." Harrison slid a document across the coffee table. 30 days ago, upon his passing, the final directive of his trust was activated. The ownership of all holding companies, and therefore 100% of Sterling Legacy Bank and its $300 billion in assets, was transferred to a single person. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "You, Ethan, you are now the sole owner of this bank." The revelation was so immense, so world-altering, that Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He was not a poor carpenter's son. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He slowly pulled the sealed envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. Harrison nodded. "You can open it now." Ethan broke the wax seal. Inside was not a long letter, but a single piece of thick paper. It was a handwritten note from his father. The note read, "Be a good man, son. That is all I ever wanted to be. The rest is just tools. Use them wisely. I love you." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he clutched the note. It was the validation he never knew he was missing. It was the final gift from a man he was only just beginning to understand. After a few moments of quiet reflection, a new thought, sharp and cold, cut through his emotional haze. "Sterling Legacy Bank," Ethan said, looking up at Harrison. "My wife? She's applying for a loan here." Harrison's expression became grim. "Yes, I saw the application come through, a $50 million line of credit for Aura Lifestyle. It is, to be frank, one of the most poorly conceived and riskiest proposals I have seen in years. It was flagged for immediate rejection." The irony was staggering. The very institution Clara and her lover were desperately trying to beg money from, the one they saw as their last hope, belonged to the man they disdained as a worthless simpleton. Their entire future depended, unknowingly, on him. A lifetime of quiet endurance, of swallowed insults and hidden pain, coalesced in that moment into a single, clear point of decision. The sleeping giant inside him was finally, fully awake. He looked at Harrison, his eyes no longer soft with grief, but hard as steel. "Don't reject the application," Ethan said, his voice calm and authoritative. The shift was so immediate that Harrison looked at him with newfound respect. "What do you have in mind?" the lawyer asked. "I want the application to proceed to the final stage," Ethan instructed. "Tell them their proposal is being considered, but it requires a personal meeting, a meeting with the new owner of the bank." A slow smile spread across Mr. Harrison's face. He understood immediately. "I think that can be arranged." The click moment had happened. The years of being the patient victim were over. The era of the mastermind had just begun. Ethan felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The fog of his marriage, of his wife's constant belittling, had lifted, revealing a path forward paved with cold, hard justice. "The plan must be surgical," Ethan stated, leaning forward in his chair. He was no longer the grieving son. He was the chairman of the board, a role he seemed to wear as naturally as his old work coat. "I don't want to just deny her. I want her to understand the full scope of her arrogance and her betrayal." Mr. Harrison nodded, his legal mind already turning the gears. "We can facilitate that. The meeting will be the centerpiece, the stage for the final act, but we can set the scene beforehand." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "Your wife's financial life is a house of cards," Harrison explained, pulling up a series of files on a tablet. "The house is mortgaged to the hilt. Her car is leased. Her business is funded by high-interest loans from predatory lenders. All of these are vulnerabilities. Ethan looked at the data, the cold, hard numbers that told the story of Clara's desperate climb. She built this prison herself. Exactly, Harrison agreed. And you now hold the keys. Many of those smaller loans were bought out by larger firms over the years. As it happens, Sterling Legacy owns a controlling interest in several of those firms. We can, at your discretion, recall those loans. The elegance of it was brutal. They would use Clara's own reckless borrowing against her. Not yet, Ethan decided. The timing must be perfect. I want her to walk into that boardroom feeling like she has already won. I want her at the absolute peak of her hubris. So we let her believe the $50 million loan is a real possibility, Harrison clarified. More than a possibility, a near certainty, Ethan commanded. Draft a letter, use language that suggests the board is highly impressed with her visionary proposal and that the final meeting with the new owner is largely a formality. Send it via special courier this afternoon. Harrison made a note. And the lover? Julian? Ethan's jaw tightened. He is to be there. The invitation should make it clear that her key consultant is expected to attend. She won't come without him. He wanted them both in the room. He wanted to see their faces when the world they had built, on his presumed weakness, shattered around them. While she is celebrating, Ethan continued, his mind working with chilling precision, I want your team to prepare a full package, foreclosure notices for the house, repossession orders for the car, a formal notice of the immediate recall of all her outstanding business debts and... He paused, the final piece clicking into place. Divorce papers. Have your best family law attorney draft them. Irreconcilable differences and infidelity. Harrison listened, his expression a mixture of professional admiration and a touch of awe. The quiet carpenter's son had a mind like a steel trap. All of these will be held, Ethan instructed. They are not to be filed or served until my signal, after the meeting is concluded. Consider it done, Harrison confirmed. We will set the meeting for 1 week from today. In the main boardroom. It's designed to be intimidating. Good, Ethan said, standing up and walking to the vast window. He looked down at the city below, a sprawling map of lives and ambitions. For so long he had felt like the smallest part of it. Now he saw it for what it was, a board game, and he was finally ready to make his move. The first step was initiated. The letter, drafted on Sterling Legacy's heavy watermark stationery, was dispatched. The bait was in the water. The week that followed was the strangest of Ethan's life. He was living a double existence. By day, he was at the bank with Harrison, absorbing decades of financial knowledge with a startling aptitude. He learned about the trusts, the investments, the bank's ethos, and his father's hidden genius. He was a quick study, his practical, methodical mind perfectly suited to understanding complex systems. He had spent his life building things from wood. Building a strategy from financial instruments was not so different. It was all about structure, pressure points, and integrity. By night, he returned home to play the part of the oblivious, downtrodden husband. It was a role he had perfected over 5 years, but now it was a conscious performance, and it filled him with a cold sense of power. Clara received the letter from Sterling Legacy Bank on a Tuesday afternoon. Ethan was in the kitchen wiping down the counters when she burst through the door, waving the envelope like a trophy. "I did it! I actually did it!" she shrieked, her face flushed with manic triumph. She didn't even wait for him to ask. She read the letter aloud, her voice trembling with excitement. Highly impressed, visionary proposal, final formality with the new owner. She threw her arms around him in a rare, performative hug. It felt like being embraced by a stranger. "We're rich, Ethan. We're finally going to be rich." She pulled back, her eyes scanning his plain clothes with renewed distaste. "The first thing we're doing is getting you a new wardrobe. My husband can't look like a charity case." "You mean your ex-husband," he thought, but his face remained a blank canvas of feigned surprise. That's wonderful, Clara." Her reaction was everything he and Harrison had predicted. Her arrogance, already monumental, inflated to staggering proportions. The world was her oyster, and people like Ethan were just there to pry it open for her. She was on the phone with Julian within minutes. "It's happening, just like you said." Her laughter was high and brittle. For the rest of the week, Ethan watched from the sidelines as Clara and Julian celebrated their unearned victory. They went out to dinners at restaurants Ethan could never have afforded, their laughter echoing as they charged the extravagant bills to cards that were already past their limit. One evening, he overheard them talking in the living room, their voices low and conspiratorial. They thought he was in the garage. "So when are you going to do it?" Julian asked. "When are you going to drop the dead weight?" "After the meeting," Clara replied. "As soon as the money is wired, I'll sit him down and be gentle but firm. I'll even give him the house. It's the least I can do, considering." Giving him the house. A house that was about to be foreclosed on, a fact only Ethan knew. The dramatic irony was so thick he could taste it. "You're too kind," Julian said, his voice slick with false admiration. "I would have just had the locks changed." They laughed together, a cruel, shared sound that cemented their bond of deceit. Ethan stood in the shadows, listening. He felt no anger, no pain. All emotion had been burned away, leaving only a resolute calm. He was the observer, the scientist watching the subjects in his experiment behave exactly as expected. On the morning of the meeting, Clara was a storm of nervous energy and excitement. She had bought a new power suit for the occasion, a sharp, white ensemble that made her look severe and ambitious. "How do I look?" she asked, spinning in front of a mirror. "Like you're ready for a board meeting," Ethan said truthfully. "Julian is picking me up," she said, gathering her portfolio. "He says we need to project an image of absolute unity and success." She paused and looked at him, a flicker of something almost like guilt in her eyes. It was gone in an instant. "Wish me luck, Ethan," she said, more as a formality than a genuine request. "You won't need it," he replied, his voice flat. "I have a feeling the new owner already has a very clear idea of your worth." She missed the double meaning entirely. "Exactly. Julian said my reputation precedes me." He watched from the window as Julian's flashy red sports car pulled up. Julian got out, looking sleek and smug in a tailored suit. He greeted Clara with a kiss that was far too long and intimate for a mere business consultant. They drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in their wake, speeding towards their glorious future. Ethan waited 5 minutes. Then he went upstairs and changed into the dark, custom-tailored suit Harrison had insisted he acquire. It fit like a second skin. It was the armor for the battle to come. He drove to the bank in his simple, reliable truck, the one Clara hated so much. He didn't use the main entrance. Harrison met him at a private underground garage, leading him up to the top floor. The boardroom was a cathedral of corporate power. A long, polished mahogany table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by 20 empty leather chairs. At the head of the table was a single, high-backed executive chair, currently facing the window and the city skyline. "They are in the waiting area," Harrison informed him. "They arrived 20 minutes early, very eager." "Let them wait," Ethan said, walking over to the window. He looked down at the city, his city now. He thought of his father, of the quiet dignity with which he lived his life. He thought of the humiliation at the funeral, the money thrown at his feet. He was not doing this for revenge, not entirely. He was doing this to restore balance, to prove that character was a more valuable asset than arrogance. He took a deep breath and sat down in the high-backed chair, his back to the door. He swiveled to face the skyline, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. "All right, Harrison," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "Send them in." The heavy doors of the boardroom opened with a soft, expensive click. Clara and Julian strode in, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. They radiated an aura of supreme confidence, the scent of victory already on them. They were ready to charm, to persuade, to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They saw Mr. Harrison standing politely by the side of the room. At the head of the impossibly long table, they saw the back of a large leather chair. The new owner was waiting. "Mr. Harrison," Clara said, her voice smooth as cream, "thank you for seeing us." "The pleasure is all mine," Harrison replied, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. "Please, have a seat." He gestured to the two chairs directly opposite the head of the table. They felt miles away from the seat of power. Clara and Julian sat, placing their identical leather portfolios on the gleaming table. They looked at each other and shared a small, triumphant smile. This was it, the final hurdle. "The new owner of Sterling Legacy is a very private individual," Harrison began, his voice formal. "He has reviewed your proposal in detail. He has a number of questions." "Of course," Julian said, leaning forward eagerly. "We are an open book. We believe in complete transparency." Ethan almost laughed. The irony was a living thing in the room. "He's ready to speak with you now," Harrison announced. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the high-backed chair. Slowly, deliberately, the chair began to swivel. The first thing they saw was a perfectly polished shoe. Then the crisp line of a dark trouser leg. Then the sleeve of a suit that was more expensive than anything Julian owned. And then the chair completed its turn. And there sat Ethan. He wasn't the Ethan they knew. He wasn't the man in the worn jeans and flannel shirt, smelling faintly of sawdust. This was a different person, a stranger wearing her husband's face. He was dressed in a suit that shouted silent power. His posture was one of absolute command, and his eyes were cold and clear as a winter sky. The blood drained from Clara's face. Her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looked garish against her pale skin. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was a silent scream of disbelief. Julian's smug expression dissolved into pure, slack-jawed shock. He blinked several times as if trying to clear a hallucination. He looked from Ethan to Harrison and back again, his brain refusing to process the scene before him. "Ethan," Clara finally whispered, the name a question, an accusation, a plea. "What is this? What are you doing here?" Ethan let the silence stretch, savoring their confusion. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the polished table. The movement was calm, controlled, the gesture of a man who owned the room because he literally did. "I'm here for a meeting," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was the voice of a judge. "A final review of a loan application from a company called Aura Lifestyle. I am the new owner." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She recoiled in her chair, shaking her head in denial. No, that's not possible. You're a carpenter." "I am my father's son," Ethan corrected her gently. "And my father, the humble carpenter you held in such contempt, happened to own this bank, and now I do." Julian finally found his voice. It was a weak, sputtering thing. "This is a joke. It has to be some kind of sick joke." "Do I look like I'm joking, Julian?" Ethan asked, his gaze shifting to the slick consultant. He had never used the man's name before, and it landed with the force of a slap. He saw the flicker of fear in Julian's eyes. The predator had just realized he was in a cage with a lion. "You spent 5 years of our marriage treating me like I was dirt beneath your shoes, Clara," Ethan began, his voice low and steady, a monologue of righteous fury he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. "You mocked my work. You disrespected my family. You shamed me at my own father's funeral." He paused, letting each accusation hang in the air. "You thought I was weak. Simple. A sad little carpenter who wasn't ambitious enough for your grand life. You thought I was blind to your debts, your lies, and your affair." He gestured with his head towards Julian. "You brought your lover into my home. You plotted behind my back to take my money, or rather, what you thought would be my money, and discard me like a piece of old furniture." Clara's face crumpled. The mask of the powerful businesswoman shattered, revealing the desperate, terrified woman beneath. Tears of rage and humiliation streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup.
"You can't do this," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Ethan, please, you don't understand. The business, everything, depends on this loan." "I understand perfectly," Ethan countered, his voice like ice. "I understand that your business is a sham, built on a mountain of debt and fraudulent projections. I understand that you see people not as human beings, but as stepping stones on your path to a life you feel entitled to, but have not earned." He reached to the side and picked up a single folder. He opened it and slid a single piece of paper across the vast expanse of the table. It stopped directly in front of Clara. It was her $50 million loan application. Stamped across it in big red letters were 2 words: "Loan denied." The sight of it broke her completely.
A raw, animalistic wail of despair escaped her lips. "No, please, I'll do anything." Julian, seeing the ship sinking, immediately began to scramble for the nearest lifeboat. "I had no idea about this," he said, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "She misled me. She told me her husband was fully supportive of the business. This is all on her." Ethan gave him a look of pure disgust. "Sit down." The command was not loud, but it had the force of a thunderclap. Julian dropped back into his chair as if his legs had been cut out from under him. "You are as much a part of this as she is," Ethan said, his eyes boring into Julian. "A parasite, feeding off her delusion, encouraging her worst impulses for your own gain. You thought you were a player. You're nothing." Ethan then slid a second folder across the table towards Clara. It landed next to the first. "What is that?" she choked out between sobs. "That," Ethan said, "is a copy of the divorce papers my lawyer will be filing this afternoon. They cite, among other things, adultery." He then produced a third folder. "And this is a foreclosure notice for the house you were so generously going to give me. The bank that holds the mortgage, as it turns out, is a subsidiary of this one. It will be repossessed in 30 days. He continued, a relentless, systematic dismantling of her entire world. "And a repossession order for your car, and a formal recall of every outstanding loan associated with Aura Lifestyle. By the end of the day, Clara, you will be bankrupt. You will have nothing." Clara stared at the pile of papers, her mind unable to comprehend the sheer speed and totality of her ruin. She looked at Ethan, her eyes begging for a mercy she had never shown him. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Ethan stood up, towering over them at the head of the table. The final act was at hand. "You asked me once if I wanted more out of life," he said, his voice resonating with 5 years of suppressed pain. "You were right. I do. I want a life built on respect, not status. On love, not transactions. On honesty, not deceit. You built your world on a foundation of lies, and now it has collapsed." he declared. "This isn't revenge, Clara. This is a consequence." He looked from her broken form to Julian's pathetic, trembling one. He felt nothing but a profound sense of release. Without another word, he turned his back on them and walked towards the door. Mr. Harrison stepped forward to intercept the now hysterical Clara and the shell-shocked Julian. Security guards appeared silently at the doorway. As Ethan walked out, he heard Clara's final desperate scream, "You'll regret this! I'll ruin you!" He didn't look back. It was impossible to ruin a man who had already found his true worth. The show was over. Justice had been served. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and absolute. As Ethan had decreed, the world Clara had so carefully constructed on a foundation of debt and deceit was dismantled piece by piece. The foreclosure notice arrived at the house the next day. Clara, who had refused to leave, was served the papers by a grim-faced courier. The house, her ultimate status symbol, was no longer hers. Her leased sports car was towed from the driveway that same afternoon. The repossession agent was unapologetic. The recall of her business loans triggered an immediate and catastrophic collapse. Suppliers demanded payment, her office landlord posted an eviction notice, and her business bank accounts were frozen. Aura Lifestyle ceased to exist in less than 48 hours. Julian, true to his parasitic nature, had vanished. He stopped answering Clara's frantic calls and texts. He scrubbed his social media of any mention of her or her company. To the world, it was as if he had never known her. He had found a new host to latch on to, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The divorce was uncontested. Clara, stripped of all financial resources, had no means to fight it. She was forced to sign the papers in a small, sterile legal office, a stark contrast to the grand boardroom where her downfall had been sealed. She was left with nothing but her expensive, now useless wardrobe and the bitter taste of her own arrogance. Ethan never saw her again. He heard through Harrison that she had been forced to move in with a distant relative in a small apartment far from the glamorous city centre she once ruled. Her name, once a fixture in local society columns, was now only mentioned in whispers, a cautionary tale of hubris and collapse. She had become a social pariah, the very thing she had always feared. For Ethan, life began anew. He did not, as Clara might have, move into a sprawling mansion or start collecting supercars. The vast wealth was not a prize to him. It was a responsibility, a set of tools his father had left him. He sold the house he had shared with Clara, the place that held so many memories of quiet humiliation. He couldn't stand to be in it any longer. He moved into a modest but comfortable apartment in the city, one with a small workshop where he could still feel the comfort of sawdust and wood grain. His first major act as the owner of Sterling Legacy Bank was not a corporate acquisition, but the creation of the David Sterling Foundation. He named it in honor of his father, using his real last name for the first time publicly. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide grants, scholarships, and interest-free loans to skilled tradespeople, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, who wanted to start their own businesses. He wanted to empower the kind of people his father had chosen to be, the people Clara had looked down upon. He took a personal, hands-on role in the foundation. He didn't just sign checks from an office. He visited workshops, reviewed business plans, and talked to the applicants. He understood their language, their passion, their challenges. He was one of them. It was during one of these site visits that he met Sophie. She was an architect, hired by a young carpentry collective that had received one of the foundation's first grants. They were converting an old warehouse into a shared workspace and training center. Ethan arrived on site in his usual attire: jeans, a simple shirt, and work boots. The foreman mistook him for a new volunteer. Sophie, seeing him pick up a piece of scrap wood and examine its grain with an expert eye, struck up a conversation. "You know your way around a piece of timber," she said, her smile genuine and warm. She had kind eyes and a directness that Ethan found refreshing. "My father taught me," he said simply. They talked for over an hour, not about finance or status, but about joinery techniques, sustainable building materials, and the beauty of a well-made object. He didn't mention who he was, and she didn't ask. She saw him as a man, not a title or a bank account. It was only later, when the foreman rushed over, flustered and apologetic, that she learned he was the man behind the foundation. She looked surprised, but her smile didn't change. "Well," she said, laughing, "that explains why you know so much. I should have guessed." Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. With Sophie, Ethan felt seen for who he truly was, a quiet, capable man who valued integrity above all else. She loved him for his character, not his currency. One sunny afternoon, months later, Ethan and Sophie stood on a balcony overlooking the completed training center. The sounds of saws and hammers filled the air, a symphony of productive creation. Young apprentices were learning from master craftsmen, their futures being built with their own hands. Sophie squeezed his hand. "Look at what you've built," she said softly. Ethan looked out at the bustling scene, a stark contrast to the cold, silent boardroom where he had last seen his ex-wife. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had used his father's tools wisely. He realized that true power was not in the ability to destroy, like he had done with Clara's fragile empire. That was just a necessary clearing of the ground. True power, he now understood, lay in the ability to build businesses, to build communities, and to build a life of purpose and love. He had lost a life he never wanted, and gained one he had never imagined possible. The ultimate victory was not the downfall of his enemies, but the quiet, solid happiness he now held in his hands. True wealth was not measured in billions of dollars, but in moments like this, and by that measure, Ethan was finally the richest man in the world.